Short introduction to myself. I studied Chinese in Taiwan in the early 1970s. And shortly after diplomatic relations were established with China, I was sent to Beijing to run the office of the U.S. In those days, it was called the National Council for U.S.-China Trade. Today, it's the U.S.-China Business Council, 美中贸易会 in Chinese. And I also lived in Hong Kong for a couple of years and in the 80s, and then I was back in Beijing for about 3 years in the 90s, working for a public relations company, doesn't exist anymore, called Burson Marsteller. It was called Boya Gongguan. And then I joined United Technologies, and I came back here in Washington for another 10 years. I took early retirement in 2008, and I managed to recreate myself as a writer. You know, if you're in the PR business, you're always writing anyway, but you're usually writing for somebody else. You know, a speech for a chairman or a press release or something. And this freed me up to basically write whatever I felt like writing for my own byline. There was something very exciting about that. And I gravitated toward Chinese American history. I was an American history major as an undergraduate. I came back, I could read Chinese and speak some Chinese. And I realized that Chinese American history was really an underserved area. When I was growing up, American history was a bunch of white guys talking to each other. That's really what we studied. We didn't study women's history. We certainly didn't study African American history. Chinese American history wasn't, Asian American history wasn't even thought of. And so by the time I, latched onto this thing, there were academics already interested in Asian American history. I'm not suggesting I invented it, but there were a lot of things to explore that hadn't been explored before. And so it was exciting. I wound up writing 4 books on this topic. So 4 books on Chinese American history. 3 Tough Chinamen was a biography of 3 brothers, not terribly important people, who came to the United States from Guangdong, which was where most of the Chinese were from. The First Chinese American, this is the Chinese version of it. I was going to flip to that in a minute. It's an English book. It's called The First Chinese American, Remarkable Life of Wang Qingfu. This was a biography of a man by the name of Wang Qingfu, who was an important figure in early Chinese American history. If you went to Wikipedia and looked for a list of important Asian Americans, he was right on the list as somebody who had opposed the Chinese Exclusion Act. And I didn't think any Chinese had opposed the Chinese Exclusion Act. I didn't realize that there was an activist from the 19th century, and there he was, and nobody had gotten to him. If he'd been a Jewish American, there'd be 3 biographies of him, but he was Chinese, so nobody had written about him, and I was delighted to get there first. The third book, Tong Wars, this is the Chinese version of it that you're looking at. There's another, the English one was called Tong Wars. This was the story of the Chinatown gangs in New York City. Chinese translation, Tang Dou. And then finally, I wrote a book that's set right here in Washington, D.C. called The Third Degree. This was, you probably never heard of this one, because I never did. It was about the murder of 3 Chinese diplomats right up on Kalorama Road. And a Chinese man was accused of the crime. He was tried for it. He was convicted of it. But because of the way that his confession had been extracted, the case went to the Supreme Court. Justice Brandeis wrote the opinion, and it laid the pipe for several decades later. It was one of the important cases that eventually led to the Miranda decision, which was very exciting because when I started the research on it, I had no idea that's where it was going to end up. So 4 books on Chinese Americans, and then 3 on Jewish Americans. The Great Kosher Meat War of 1902, the Chief Rabbi's Funeral, and then the Great Christmas Boycott, which is coming out next month. They're all stories of what we call Lower East Side Jews, Russian and Eastern European immigrants to the United States. And that's my own tradition. My great-grandmother was living in New York City on the Lower East Side during the time of these books. So Murder in Manchuria, the one I'm going to talk about today, was something of a departure for me. It's the only book I've written that wasn't set in America, for one thing. And it was an attempt to blend 2 of my main interests, Jewish history and Chinese American history, Chinese history. But interestingly enough, even though it's set in China, there's not a lot of Chinese people in the book. This is a story of a bunch of guailos, you know, a bunch of foreigners who found themselves living in China at a very interesting time in Chinese history. I never studied Chinese history, and what I know about Chinese history, especially during the period between the beginning of the 20th century and, let's say, World War II, and specifically in Manchuria, I learned doing this book. So I'm sure there are people in the audience who know way more about this than I do. Let me take you back to Beijing in the 1990s. which is really where this book got its start. In the mid-90s, I was living in China. I was one of the founders of what the liberal Jewish community in Beijing, we called it Kehilat Beijing. That's a Hebrew word meaning community. And it was the Jewish community of Beijing. We had Jews, mostly from the United States and Canada, but some from Europe and a few from Russia, some from Israel. And we began regular services for the Sabbath on probably about 1995. We believe it was the first organized Jewish community in modern day in Beijing. Not in China, but in Beijing. Very aware of the fact that the Jews had preceded us in China. In fact, probably as early as the 8th century. That's when Jews wound up in Kaifeng, which you see in the middle of the map there. Probably from the Silk Road. But most of the Jewish history of China is 19th century and early 20th century. And that's mostly the Pacific ports, Hong Kong, Shanghai, Qingdao, Dalian, Shenyang, those places. There were two really different types of Jews who came in. There were Sephardic Jews from the Middle East, and then there were Russian and Eastern European Jews, mostly from Russia, mostly in the north. So in 1997, several members of our Jewish community decided we were going to take a weekend trip to the city of Harbin because we knew that there had been a Jewish community there and we didn't know very much about it. And we wanted to see if there was anything left of the Jewish presence in Harbin, which began at the very, very end of the 19th century, just a few years from the 20th, and was pretty much over after World War II. There were a couple of stragglers who lasted a little bit longer than that, but mostly by World War II or a little bit after it, people had left for other places. And of course, as everybody knows, Shanghai was a big location for a Jewish community that during the war. But this was Harbin. This is the Jewish cemetery in Harbin. But there were buildings that we found that had been Jewish owned and Jewish constructed. There were two synagogue buildings, one of which had become a public security club. The other one was a Ministry of Railways hostel. There was a school which had been the Jewish school. Chinese citizens of Korean extraction were going to school there. But you could still see the Stars of David in the window. It was really very exciting. Okay, so I got curious. How did these Jews get there? What were they doing there? And when did they leave? So as it happens, just about the same time that my grandparents were making the trek from the Pale of Settlement to the United States, in their case it was Belarus, that's where they came from, there was a much smaller group of Jews, very much the same people that I come from, that went the other way and wound up in Manchuria, which nobody really says anymore. I guess it's an ancient term. Everybody calls it Dongbei now, which is the Chinese way to say it. People don't tend to use the word anymore, but in those days it was Manchuria. And there it is on the map in green. And because of its location, late 19th century and until the end of World War II, Manchuria had the misfortune of being coveted by 3 different countries. China arguably had the strongest claim to it because it had been part of China under the Qing dynasty. But China was weak and it really was not very able to protect it. The other countries that were interested in it were Russia and Japan, both of which wanted to expand their spheres of influence. Japan wanted the natural resources, it wanted the wealth, and it actually wanted a place to resettle some of its population. It was overpopulated at this point. That was what the Japanese wanted. The Russians, they wanted access to a warm water port, known in those days as Port Arthur. Today we call it Dalian. The Russians had Vladivostok, which was also a Pacific port, but it froze up for several months during the year. And if they had access to Port Arthur, which is a warm water port, they would have had 365-day access to the Sea of Japan, the Yellow Sea, ultimately the Pacific Ocean, and that's what they wanted. I'm not going to go into the details of the Sino-Japanese War and the Russo-Japanese War, mostly because I don't remember all of them. But suffice it to say that they fought over Manchuria. Manchuria was fought over, it was invaded, and it was colonized. Because the Chinese were concerned that the Japanese were going to make another go after the Sino-Japanese War. Russia signed an agreement with the Chinese which said that if the Japanese come back, we will help you. We will come to your aid. But what we want in return, right of way to Vladivostok. They had already built this Trans-Siberian Railway up to the edge of Manchuria. They wanted to go all the way to Vladivostok. Now they could have gone through Russia to do it. They would have had to go all the way over where that curve is at the top. But if they went through Manchuria, they would save 500 miles a little more than that, of track. So they save a great deal of money about it. And also it gave them more of a foothold in Manchuria, which is what they wanted. And then at a second agreement that they reached a few years later, they built another railroad from Harbin all the way to Dalian. The first one was called the China Eastern Railway. This one was called the South Manchuria Railway. And where the railroad, the first railroad, where it crossed the Sungari River, which is the Songhuajiang in Chinese, that's where Harbin was developed. Harbin was nothing until the very, very late 19th century. It was a fishing village. If you go there, it looks a great deal more like St. Petersburg than it does any Chinese city you've ever been into. Don't look for the temples with the arches, and look for the big boulevards and the almost Stalin-esque kind of buildings, even though Stalin was a little bit later than this. It was a Russian city that was in the middle of China. That's really what it was. Built by the Russians. The reason it grew up was that this was the headquarters of the railroad. This was the headquarters of the Russian presence in Manchuria. It was the Russian government's, because when they got the right of way, they got, I think it was 20 miles to the north and 20 miles to the south. That whole strip was Russian controlled. And that meant that Russian law applied and Chinese law did not apply. Russia didn't own it in a way. It was leased to Russia, but Russia was in charge. They wanted to keep that because it was a foothold in this very strategic area that they wanted to be part of. They wanted to build a business and an industrial center in Manchuria. They wanted to exploit some of the natural resources. If you ever doubted that it was a Russian city, you got the onion domes and roof. That's the synagogue. That's one of the synagogues that I showed you earlier. And I showed you that building earlier too. And this building, the Hotel Moderne, is very important to the story. So they made an offer to Russian businessmen. They wanted Russian businessmen to come out and set up enterprises, exploit the resources, and build businesses. But there was kind of an anemic response by the Russian businessmen. And then they got an idea. Let's get the Jews to do it. If we bring the Jews over, they know how to make money. They know how to do all of this kind of stuff. And in particular, it was a good offer for a lot of Russian Jews because they weren't well treated in Russia. Their sons could be conscripted into the military service at the age of 12 and forced to serve for decades. My grandfather was one of them, actually. When I was in Minsk, I saw his draft record, and I saw the notation about the day he deserted to go to the United States. Jews were targets of pogroms. They were subject to special taxes. They're subject to quotas in going to school. Certain professions were closed to them. And what the Tsar's government said was, go to Manchuria and all's forgiven. No more pogroms, no more restrictions like you, just be fruitful, multiply, build businesses, and make money. And so that was an attractive offer for a lot of Jews. And at their peak, there were something like 20,000 Russian Jews living in Manchuria. They weren't all Russian, some of them were Ukrainian and stuff, but the 20,000 ethnic Jews that were living there. So life in Harbin was not paradise, but it was pretty good for the first couple of decades of the century. And many Jews prospered, and among them was a man by the name of Joseph Kaspé. He was a veteran of the Russo-Japanese War, and when he was decommissioned in 1905, he didn't see much reason to go back to Russia. It really had not been a good experience for him. And he settled down in Harbin. He started a watch repair shop, which he then parlayed into a jewelry store, made a fair amount of money as a jeweler. And by 1913, he had amassed enough capital to buy a lot on what they called Kitaiskaya Street, which is Russian for Chinese Street. Today it's called, I think it's Zhongyang Dajie or something like that. But it was the main drag then, it's the main drag today for shopping in Harbin. And he built the Hotel Moderne right there. Moderne as in modern. It was the first European standard hotel in Harbin. And it's where we stayed in the 1990s when we went to Harbin. We didn't want to stay anywhere else. Life was going along just fine, and then 1918 comes along and they have the Russian Revolution. And when the communists took over Russia, the Bolsheviks, they were the red Russians. The white Russians were the ones who didn't like the communists and vice versa. A lot of them fled for their lives. And a lot of them, a couple of 100,000 easily, probably more than that, went over the border into Manchuria. And many of them had lost all of their wealth. A lot of them had been wealthy. They lost everything. They show up as paupers in Manchuria, very resentful about their treatment. And among the people that they blamed for the Russian Revolution were the Jews. Life became less safe for the Jewish community of Harbin at this point. There were kidnappings, mostly not to kill people, mostly just to get ransom so that they could get money. The synagogue at one point was burned down. Suddenly there was an enemy for the Jews. The good days were behind them. Some of them were actually admirers of Mussolini, and they set up a party in Harbin called the Russian Fascist Party. Many of them wanted to restore the Tsar's family, restore the monarchy. But in any event, what they wanted was to get rid of the communists. And they used it as a jumping off point to send propaganda into Russia, anything that they could do to destabilize the regime. And this was the headquarters of it, but they actually set up satellite organizations around the world. But this was the center of gravity for it. And a man by the name of Rodzaevsky was in charge of it. So now we move to 1931, enter the Japanese. Japan invades Manchuria on a pretext. It carves the region off of China and declares it an independent country of Manchukuo, Manchukuo in Chinese. This was prologue for Japan's plans for what they tried to do in World War II, basically take over Asia. This was the first step. And what they wanted from Manchuria, in addition to its wealth, and in addition to possibly a place where they could send some of their population, they wanted money. They believed that Manchuria should pay for its own colonization. And where were you going to go for money in Manchuria? The Jews. They had a lot of property in Harbin. They had made businesses for themselves. They were considered wealthy. They didn't want to do it directly because they had another goal here, the Japanese. They had created this independent country, ostensibly independent country of Manchukuo. And they wanted international recognition for it. Most people who knew anything about it knew that it was a puppet state of Japan. The Japanese were making all the decisions. But they wanted to promote this fiction that it was an independent country, that it had become independent because it hated China and wanted to break off from China, and that Japan had simply helped the process along. They wanted it to get into the League of Nations, and so they didn't want to look like thugs, essentially, by going after the Jews directly. Enter the Russians. You got a bunch of poor Russians who are very happy to kidnap Jews, and you got the Japanese who want the money, and it was an alliance that they formed. The Japanese wanted no fingerprints on what they were doing, so they essentially hired the Russians to do their dirty work. This is the setup for the story that I wrote about. Interestingly enough, the two communities had very different justifications for going after Jews. The Japanese just wanted their money. They weren't anti-Semitic. They had very little, if any, experience with Jews. The Russians just wanted revenge. I mean, they wanted the money too, but they mostly wanted to humiliate the Jews and go after them. So it was a partnership made in hell, essentially. And that brings us to the story of Semyon Kaspé, who was the son of Joseph Kaspé, whose picture you just saw. And he was a young and very talented concert pianist. He was born in Harbin. He went to elementary school and high school in Harbin, and then, like a lot of the wealthier expatriates in Manchuria, he was sent abroad for university education. After the 1918 revolution, the Russians basically said to the Jews there, to any Russian citizens who were living outside of Russia, you can have a Soviet passport if you want, but if you don't, you're on your own. And people like Joseph Kaspé and his family, they became stateless. And they were very vulnerable if they were stateless, because nobody would stand up for them if the Japanese did something to them. And the Japanese had their eye, among other things, on the modern hotel that Joseph Kaspé owned. That was a gem. It was a real property that would have been very interesting for them to have, and it was worth a lot of money. Well, anyway, Semyon had just come back from France, where he had trained, and he had done something very smart while he was there. He and his brother had both studied there. They became French citizens while they were there. So they were no longer stateless. And the minute they got back, he got back, I think his brother stayed in France for a little while longer. Joseph Kaspé signed over all of his properties to his sons. And he put the French flag over the Hotel Moderne. And this was a signal to the Japanese that if you screw around with me, you're screwing with the French. We're no longer stateless. This is a very strategic and very important decision. And the Japanese, they didn't screw around with it. They didn't want trouble with the French. So Semyon comes back, he's performing concerts, he goes to Tokyo, he goes to Shanghai, and he's planning on a concert tour of the United States. And he takes up with a woman named Lydia Shapiro, also born in Harbin, also a musician. She actually at this point was married with 4 children, but she had left her husband and come back to Harbin to live with her father. And they were dating. And they were musicians, they had a lot of things in common. And one evening in 1933, he invites Lydia over to the Moderne for a musical evening. He wants to escort her home like a good gentleman after the evening is over. At this stage, Joseph Kaspé was very worried about kidnapping because a lot of the rich Jews had to worry about that. And he had a chauffeur with a gun, and he also had bodyguards at the Hotel Moderne. When his son wanted to take his girlfriend back home, Kaspé said, take the car and take with the chauffeur so you'll have some protection. And Semyon he didn't really think in those terms. He hadn't been living there that long. He wasn't as afraid of the Japanese as he should have been. And what happened was, when they take the car to Lydia's house, the car is attacked and they are abducted. Lydia is let go almost immediately, which is interesting because her father was also a wealthy Jewish merchant, but they were after Kaspé. And she was let go, and they told her to go back to Joseph Kaspé and tell him that the ransom was going to be $1.4 million in today's dollars, which was outrageous. And Joseph Kaspé couldn't afford it. This was the Depression. He had already mortgaged the place up to the hilt. There was simply no way he could pay that. They took Semyon to a hideout outside of town. So what Joseph did was he went to the French consulate for help. He said, they should be helping him. He's a French citizen. And in particular, the deputy consul was a man by the name of Albert Chambon. If you want to ask me later about it, I found his children in France. They were very helpful to me as I wrote the book. He had left a memoir that had never been published, and they gave me a copy of it. Chambon was a good man. He was also a friend of Semyon Kaspé's. They interceded with the Japanese authorities. They tried to enlist them in helping to go and find where Semyon Kaspé was being held. And the Japanese were helpful up to a point until Chambon realized they were really only pretending to be helpful. And he started to suspect that they were in on it. And he hired his own detectives. And they pretty much figured out where Semyon was being held in the countryside. I'm not going to go further in the plot. Nobody will ever read the book if I give all the secrets away. But the book takes the reader through the search for Semyon and his captors, their capture and the eventual trials of his kidnappers, and how the whole process was manipulated by the Japanese, who on the one hand were feeling tremendous international pressure, because this got international publicity, this kidnapping, partly because the Jewish community around the world made a big deal out of it, but not just that. On the one hand, the international world, the world wanted to see a fair trial of these kidnappers. The Japanese didn't want a fair trial. These were the guys they were working with. And if they actually sold them down the river, they wouldn't get future cooperation from the Russians. So there was a lot of back and forth and a lot of playing around with the justice system, which on a good day wasn't very fair, because it was a horrible witch's brew blend of Japanese legal system and the legal system they had inherited from the Russians and some from the Chinese. But I will tell you that if you read the book, you will meet a couple of very interesting characters. My favorite was a guy named Kostya Nakamura. He was Japanese, but he was fluent in Russian, and he actually took Kostya was his Konstantin was his Russian name. He was a truly despicable person. He was a pedophile. He was a drug lord. He ran a brothel, and he used his position to enrich himself. He was in charge of what they called the Kempeitai, which in Chinese is the Xianbingdui. It was the gendarmerie, the military police. Butter wouldn't have melted in his mouth when he was talking to the authorities about how much he wanted to help and how much he wanted to free Semyon. But they began to suspect that Nakamura was in on the kidnapping. He was not only in on the kidnapping, he directed the kidnapping. But he wasn't the guy who ordered the kidnapping. And then you would meet an Italian spy for hire by the name of Amleto Vespa. He was also one of my favorites. He was a spy. And when the Japanese came in, they said, "You're working for us now." And he said, "No, I'm not." And they said, "Yes, you are, or we're going to kill your family." So he became an unwilling combatant working on behalf of the Japanese, but undermining them every chance he got. He wrote a memoir. He finally got out of Manchuria, went to Shanghai, wrote a memoir. It was sort of a tell-all. He didn't want to write it in Manchuria because he was afraid that he would get in trouble. And then the worst thing happened. The Japanese took Shanghai, and that was the end of Amleto Vespa. They believe he was killed either in the Philippines or in Taiwan. They're not sure. Nobody knows to this day. There's even a cameo appearance by Puyi, the boy emperor of China, who was, for a while, the emperor of Manchuria. He didn't have any power, but he was a figurehead. But they brought him in because they wanted illusion of a monarchy. I want to tell you just a little bit about the research that went into this book before I stop. For most of my books, I'm usually dependent on newspapers to construct a narrative. There's some wonderful websites now that have historic newspapers online and keyword searchable. This is a huge benefit for researchers. Never existed when I was younger. What it means is, in my day, You want to do research on one of these topics, you truck on down to the library, you get the microfilm roll that you hope will correspond to when the article might appear. You don't even know if there's an article, and you scroll through it until you get dizzy, and if you're lucky, you find what you're looking for. What this has done, this technology, is that you find articles that you're looking for, but you also find articles you didn't know you were looking for. When I wrote the biography of Wang Qingfu, I found a really useful article about him in the newspaper from Postville, Iowa. I've tracked this man's travels in the United States. He never went to Iowa. There's no way on God's earth I ever would have known to search that newspaper, but there it was on Chronicling America, which is the Library of Congress's site. That one's free. Some of these cost money, that one's free. You know, any topic you want to research in American history, go to Chronicling America, put in some keywords. But if you're researching a Chinese name, misspell it a couple of times, because there's no way you can really figure out, you know, how they spelled it in those days. But you can just get tremendous numbers of articles. Genealogy Bank's another really good one. Newspapers.com, all those. Israel's Messenger. There's also a website that's not on this one if you're writing Jewish books. The Israelis, the National Library of Israel has a site. Just Google, if you're interested in it, just Google historic Jewish newspapers, you'll find it. Free, and they have newspapers in English and French and Yiddish and Ladino and Hebrew and any language in places where Jews lived. So you can sit down at your computer, you don't even have to go to the library, find a topic for yourself. Within a week, you can have 2,000 articles at your disposal. Okay, not so easy when you're writing about China. Very few historic Chinese newspapers are online and keyword searchable. A few, and I'm hoping a lot more, but that's really very difficult to find. ProQuest has a dozen English language newspapers from China, which I used to great advantage in writing this particular book. I don't think it was a Harbin newspaper, but the Shanghai Jewish community had a newspaper, and they covered the Kaspé case very carefully. They were, in fact, the most vocal about what was going on in Harbin. The bad news is that a lot of the papers that were published in Manchuria don't seem to survive, at least aren't accessible to me. There is a Jewish archive in Harbin. When the Jewish community left, there were papers left over. They exist, but nobody other than Chinese government officials, as far as I know, has been ever granted access to it. And the Russian archives where, you know, they don't even answer your emails, you know, forget it. So there were limits to what I could research. But I did reach out to a few people who were knowledgeable about Harbin history, all right? And the first one was Dan Ben Kanan. Dan is an Israeli who may well be the only Jew living in Harbin right now. He's not descended from the original ones. He's an Israeli scholar who's married to a Chinese. And he's the most knowledgeable, I think, of anyone about the history of Jews in Harbin. He's written several books about it. He was very open to sharing and answering all of my questions. Not that I could do anything for him, you know. That's one of the nicest things is finding people who know this stuff who are very happy to help you. And I've been very fortunate that I didn't get doors slammed in my face. I figured out how to spell Semyon Kaspé in Russian. So I Googled him in Russian, and I found my way to this website written by this woman, Nara Klebja. She is she's not Jewish, but she's a descendant of Russians who were living in Harbin. And that is her intellectual interest. And she's posted all sorts of old articles and pictures and stories on it. And of course, Russian is not one of my languages, but you know, thanks to Google Translate and thanks to the new sites, we actually corresponded back and forth, neither of us knowing the other language. But with the computer, you can just do it. So we had several things back and forth, and she sent me some very useful articles. And then finally, Noriko Uchiyama Valuyev. She is a Japanese married to a Russian. She's a scholar. She speaks beautiful Russian. In fact, she is writing a biography of one of the kidnappers of Semyon Kaspé, whose memoir, believe it or not, exists in the Columbia University Library, all in Russian. And she's written a couple of articles about it. She sent them to me in Japanese. Boom, translate. 98% comprehension. I mean, really amazing what you can do. Because there were a lot of languages here. There were 8 different languages of materials that I used here. Isaac Shapiro, who just died, was the son of Lydia Shapiro, the girlfriend of Semyon Kaspé. He was raised in Japan, actually. An attorney in New York City, actually a very famous attorney in Japanese-American affairs. He wrote a book, a memoir called Growing Up as a Foreigner. Everything I knew about Semyon's girlfriend I got from him. He also gave me a couple of pictures that I could use in the book. So that's English. Italian, remember Amleto Vespa. This is his book. This is his memoir, Secret Agent of Japan. Scholars don't think it's entirely accurate. He had some grudges and things that he was, but when he was talking about personalities of people and stuff, I was pretty sure he was dead on. He knew them. And so I used his work, but sparingly. And if he said something outrageous, I didn't use it. This is a biography of Amleto Vespa written in Italian that I was able to find an English translation of. So I was able to do that. Italian, again, not one of my languages. Probably the most important primary source that I used were dispatches from the French consulate in Harbin back to Paris, CC'd to Beijing. The French diplomat writing every couple of days back to Paris about the search for Semyon Kaspé and when they started to suspect that the Japanese were in on it, etc. This was not known to exist, these files, until about 1905, and a French scholar found them in the archives at the Quai d'Orsay, which are the archives of the French Foreign Ministry, got them declassified. So all I had to do was write to the French archive, and they sent it to me, all in French. I studied enough French in high school and college that I didn't have any trouble going through this stuff. 85 pages of French was a lot, and I couldn't use machine translation because it was a carbon of a carbon. You know how that goes? But I could read it, you know, and if I had trouble, there were dictionaries. So a lot of the materials were in French. And in addition to that, Chambon himself had written a memoir shortly before he died about his time as a diplomat in, I had heard about it, I found a reference to it, but it was nowhere. No library seemed to have it. And so I went through a friend of mine who lives in France, and I said, I'm looking for descendants of Albert Chambon. And we found out that he was a member of a particular club in Paris before he died. We wrote to the club. They said, yes, his son is still alive. They got me his email address. I wrote to him. You know, as luck would have it, he was fluent in English. And he said, my father has this memoir and nobody's ever looked at it because he couldn't get it published. I said, I would love to have this. And he sent it to me. At this point, I had already sent the book into the publisher, and I recalled it because when I read this, I realized I'd gotten a few things wrong, and I wanted to make sure that I was doing it right. So they sent it back to me. I said, I just need a week. And I promise you, we'll make back the week in the schedule, but I really have to go back over this. And they were very nice about it, and they let me do it. Russian. This book was written in 1958. Finale in China, I think is how the name translates. Russian's definitely not one of my languages, but I was fortunate to find an electronic copy of it. And all I had to do was cut and paste the characters. I put them into a couple of different translation engines, compared the two, and was able to figure out what they were saying. This is Yiddish. Very little survives in Yiddish. There was a daily Yiddish newspaper in Harbin, but it's not around. But here and there I could find an article that someone had saved in a file or something like that. It wasn't terribly useful. Hebrew was the other one. Theodor Kaufmann was the son of the head of the Jewish community of Harbin. He wrote a memoir about his life in Harbin and his father's story. And his father played a minor role in the Kaspé kidnapping. Hebrew, again, not one of my languages, but I know enough Israelis that were willing to read a few pages and tell me what was in it. Most of the Chinese scholarship that I saw was fairly derivative of what the Western scholarship was about. I didn't find a great deal that seemed different or that really pushed my horizons in any one particular direction. But there was some Chinese scholarship, at least on the Jewish community of Harbin. And any book about the Jewish community of Harbin has something about the Kaspé case. A lot of people see it as the seminal event that started the exodus of Jews from Harbin, who felt that after they saw what justice looked like under the Japanese, that they couldn't count on it. As a practical matter, Jews had started leaving before this case was finally resolved, but it accelerated the process for sure. And that answered my question about, where'd they go? Why did they leave? Finally, Japanese. My friend Noriko sent me this book and fortunately told me which pages to look at because there was no way I was going to get through the whole thing. This was probably the first book in Japan written about this kidnapping by a Japanese reporter. And then there were her articles as well that were also in Japanese. Revisiting the case, I basically tried to answer some questions that had never really been addressed. Notably, the most important one was, who ordered the kidnapping? And it turns out that Amleto Vespa gave me the best clues that I was able to use. He mentioned that among his overseers in the spy game in Harbin, he mentioned a new head had come in of this particular unit that he was reporting to, that the guy spoke some Russian, that he had a mustache, that he was about 50 years old, and that he had talked to Vespa about how to go after the Kaspés. He wanted to know whether Kaspé was close to the French consulate, and he'd ask all those kinds of questions. So I was pretty sure that I was onto my man, but I didn't know who he was. And then I looked at some of the biographies of some of the military men, the Japanese military men who were there, and sure enough, there was one who was 50-ish, he had a mustache, he had served in Russia, so he spoke Russian, and I'm pretty sure I have my man, but nobody can be 100% sure. It's a century later. The Jews who left, a lot of them went to Shanghai, a lot of them went to Hong Kong, some went to Israel, some went to Australia, some went to North America. By a few years after World War II was over, they were not killed by the Japanese during the war. They were not well treated particularly, but the Japanese maintained them. The Japanese actually had some use for the Jews. There's a wonderful book called the Fugu Plan, which was a plan that had been proposed to the Japanese government to make use of the Jews and even invite more of them to live in Japanese-controlled lands in Asia and basically use them because on the one hand, they thought they could make them money. And on the other hand, they thought that the international Jewish conspiracy was going to be useful to them in lobbying other countries. And this was the idea. It was a Rabbi Tokayer, actually. Marvin Tokayer wrote the book. You can get it used. I don't know if it's still available. It's called The Fugu Plan. It's a very interesting read. So they weren't killing Jews. They weren't like the Nazis. They weren't particularly nice to them, but they maintained the Jews who had stayed behind in Manchuria during the war. And then after the war, the jig was up. And in 1949, when the communists took over, they knew they weren't really welcome to stay on. And that was kind of the end of the deal. Thank you.
It was surprising to me to hear that so much media coverage of this case was allowed. Did you get a sense that the Japanese were kind of, their hands were tied, they had to allow international journalism because to lock it down would be too thuggish or would hurt their image management? Were they just unable at this point to control international journalism and coverage of this case? What was the kind of the media sphere looking like in Manchuria at this time?
The Chinese approached the League of Nations and said, this is bogus, this is not an independent country, don't do this. They actually set up a delegation to visit China, Japan, and Manchuria to make an assessment as to whether we should recognize this new country. And they sent them to Harbin, among other places. They stayed at the Hotel Moderne. The Japanese arrested anybody they thought might be able to give them the skinny on what was really going on there and kept them in jail until the delegation left. They killed people who tried to approach them with petitions and things like this. They were very intent on managing the visit of these people so that they only heard good news from everybody. They knew who they wanted to talk to them, etc. I mean, it's perfect totalitarian tactics and stuff. So they were very, very interested in controlling. And there was a price to pay when the League of Nations said, this is bogus, when they finally decided they're not going to do it. I don't know that there were a lot of international journalists in Harbin at the time. A lot of the news came out of the Jewish community and showed up in the Shanghai Jewish newspaper. So I think that was done on the telephone, that sort of thing. I don't remember a byline of a reporter, too many reporters that were based there. But you're right that what was under the Japanese control, they absolutely did control. And there were several newspapers that everybody knew they were supporting, but they were also editing. Thanks everybody for coming.